In April 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. The islands, known in Argentina as the Malvinas, are a self-governing overseas territory of the UK, but had been the subject of an Argentine claim to sovereignty ever since the British invaded them in 1833. By 1982, the oppressive ruling military junta in Argentina, headed by General Leopoldo Galtieri, was struggling with an extremely poor economic performance and growing civil unrest. In order to divert national attention and play off long-standing feelings of ownership of the islands, Argentina occupied the Falklands. The UK, under the direction of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, retaliated, although war was never formally declared by either side. On the 8th of June, the RFA Sir Galahad was at anchor in the harbour at Port Pleasant, a spot often known as Bluffcove. 370 metres away was another landing ship, the RFA Sir Tristram. A week earlier, 5,000 further British troops had arrived at the islands, meaning that the new British divisional commander, Major General Jeremy Moore, now had the numbers to orchestrate an offensive against Stanley, the capital and only real town on the Falkland Islands. On the Sir Galahad were the 1st Welsh Guards, who had been sent to support this offensive in advance along the southern approach. However, a series of changed military decisions, confusion over place names, and disagreements over how the ships were to be unloaded led to the two ships occupying the harbour almost fully laden and without escorts or air defence. Argentine Skyhawk fighters attacked the Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, which both caught fire. They were very badly damaged in the attack, and 48 men were killed, 32 of them Welsh Guards on the Sir Galahad. The Sir Tristram lost 2 crewmen, although the large bomb that smashed through the decks failed to detonate immediately, facilitating the evacuation of the surviving crew. Many soldiers were wounded, over 150 suffering burns and other injuries. The Sir Galahad had already been hit by a 1,000-pound bomb in May, which, fortunately for all on board, didn't detonate, and it had also been strafed in an air attack. But the bombs that hit at Bluffcove were fatal. After the war, the hulk was towed out to sea and sunk, becoming an official war grave and a protected place under the Protection of Military Remains Act. The Sir Tristram was abandoned, but refloated after the war and towed to Stanley, before returning to the UK in 1984 on a heavy lift ship and being substantially rebuilt. After that, the ship saw active service in the Gulf War and the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s. It also supported British operations in Sierra Leone and was part of the British fleet supporting the invasion of Iraq. The Sir Tristram was finally decommissioned in December 2005, but is still used for training exercises. The Falklands War ended on the 14th of June 1982, with Argentine commander General Menendez signing the surrender. The conflict resulted in 258 British and 649 Argentine deaths, and nearly 10,000 Argentine troops were made prisoners of war. Today, the islands remain under British control, but even now, Argentina continues to stake its claim to sovereignty, as it has done for nearly 200 years. Crop circles are patterns created by flattened crops, such as barley, wheat and corn. Over the years, they have been reported all over the world, but since the late 1970s have been particularly common in England, specifically along a geological tract called the Aquifer Line. This is a line of water-bearing rock that runs between Dorset and Norfolk. Many theories have been aired about their origins. Some think they were created by extraterrestrial forces. Others point to unusual geological conditions or violent weather patterns. However, a study conducted in 2000 concluded that 80% of crop circles were hoaxes, created by humans such as the artist John Lundberg. And what of the farmers whose fields are affected? Lundberg cited the Stonehenge farmer who in 1996 charged tourists to look at a circle in his field, pocketing £30,000 in a month for a crop that was worth about £150. An estimated 1,530,000 people killed or wounded. These are the astonishing figures from the Battle of Stalingrad, often regarded as the bloodiest in history. The World War II battle between the German Axis forces and Soviet Russia over the city now known as Volgograd lasted from the 21st of August 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943. making it at 199 days, the largest single battle in history. The siege of Stalingrad was part of Fall Blau, part of Hitler's grand plan to secure the Eastern Front. Like Operation Barbarossa, it was doomed to failure and is considered to have been a major turning point in the Second World War. Strategically and symbolically, Stalingrad was an important target for Hitler, who ignored advice from his generals in order to attack the city named after his great foe, Joseph Stalin. The battle began with heavy bombing by the German Luftwaffe, before ground forces moved into the city, at one point securing up to 90% of it. The fighting was long, arduous, and with no regard for civilian life. Captured areas changed hands over and over again, and snipers reigned supreme in the shelled-out buildings. As winter approached, the Russians benefited. The frozen Volga River made it easier for them to get supplies through, while the Germans found themselves cut off, starving, and eventually simply freezing to death. The turnaround came on the 19th of November 1942, when the Russians put Operation Uranus into action. Its main objective was to push through the weaker outlying Axis flanks, which mostly consisted of outnumbered and poorly equipped Romanian infantry. The next day, Soviet forces moved west in a pincer movement, meeting 2 days later near Kalak and sealing a ring around Stalingrad. The Russians wanted to film this decisive moment for propaganda, but had no cameras available and had to restage the events later. The Germans retaliated with Operation Wintergewitter, but as the severe Russian winter set in, the German forces were soon dying in their thousands. By the new year, the Germans could hold out no longer, and on the 31st of January, Friedrich Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces, just a day after being promoted to General Feldmarschall by Adolf Hitler. This is runway 24 at the International Airport in Manchester, England. On the 22nd of August 1985, a British Air Tours Boeing 737, designated Flight 28M, was on the runway in its takeoff phase. It was heading for Kerkyra Airport on the Greek island of Corfu. The plane, which had been renamed from Goldfinch to River Orin, had 131 passengers on board, along with 6 crew. As the plane was taxiing along, the pilot heard a bang, and thinking there was a punctured tyre, he followed procedure, braking slowly and activating the thrust reversers. Unfortunately, it later became clear that this action exacerbated the true problem, which was a fire in the number 1 engine. The pilot's actions, heading the plane into a prevailing wind, only served to fan the flames further. Within no time at all, the blaze was raging through the cabin, fed by fuel spilling from the port wing. The toxic smoke killed 48 of the 55 people who died in the accident, with the others succumbing to the heat and flames. 78 passengers and 4 crew managed to escape via the passenger chutes and flight deck escape webbing, although 15 of them were seriously injured. After the accident, an inquiry found that thermal fatigue had caused a crack in the combustor can on the port engine. It was also revealed that the combustor had cracked before and that the welding to repair it had not been satisfactory. The accident also led to calls for increased safety measures. It was noted that the last passenger to escape took over 5 minutes to exit the aircraft. Better floor lighting and improved seating arrangements were demanded to combat this. Considering the number of deaths from smoke inhalation, there were also suggestions that aeroplanes should carry smoke hoods, but the United Kingdom Civil Aviation Authority deemed this idea impractical. Another idea of installing sprinkler-like misting systems was also vetoed as too expensive. Opened on New Year's Day 1921, the glamorous Ambassador Hotel was a Hollywood landmark, regular home of the Academy Awards, and the site of the famed Coconut Grove nightclub. But on the 5th of June 1968, it became famous for a more notorious event, the assassination of Robert Francis Kennedy, as he walked through the kitchens, shortly after claiming victory in the Californian Democratic primary election, a significant step on his way to the presidency. Bobby Kennedy, shot 3 times, died the next day at the Good Samaritan Hospital. Sirhan Bishara Sirhan, a Palestinian immigrant, was arrested for the shooting, in which 5 other people were injured. He remains in prison to this day. Recent evidence has come to light, though, that points to a second shooter, as at least 10 shots were fired, and Sirhan's gun was an 8-shot .22 caliber revolver. Also, powder burns on Kennedy's ear and residue in his hair suggested that Sirhan wasn't close enough to have fired the fatal shot. Then there was the unexplained presence of several CIA operatives, including David Sanchez Morales, known for his anger at the Kennedys for what he saw as their betrayal during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy's death was a huge shock for a nation that was still grieving from the assassination of his brother, John F. Kennedy, just over 4 years earlier. Having resigned as Attorney General in 1964, Bobby Kennedy was the senator for New York at the time of his death. And in early 1968, he had announced that he was running for president. With a commitment to racial and economic justice, non-aggressive foreign policy, and decentralization of power, Robert Kennedy was considered to be even more progressive than JFK. He was close to Martin Luther King, and his impromptu speech in Indianapolis following King's murder is often credited as the reason that that city escaped the riots that broke out elsewhere. Despite his renewed commitment to political change after JFK's death, Kennedy was said to be a changed man, personally devastated by the tragedy. In 1965, he was in the party that made the first ascent of the 4,300-meter Mount Kennedy, a peak named in his brother's honor in Yukon, Canada. Bobby's funeral was at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, where he was eulogized by his brother Senator Ted Kennedy, who adapted a George Bernard Shaw quote saying, "Some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?" After the funeral mass, Kennedy's body was taken by a special train to Washington, D.C., passing by thousands of mourners lining the tracks. The only person ever buried there at night, he was interred at Arlington National Cemetery, next to JFK. Close as they were in life, it seemed only fitting that they should remain that way in death. The English electric Canberra was a jet-powered light bomber constructed in large numbers throughout the 1950s. It was used for reconnaissance, weather study, and as a tactical bomber. It was originally designed in the mid-1940s as a replacement for the de Havilland Mosquito bomber, although the prototype didn't take to the skies until May 1949. They were used by the UK's RAF right up until 2006. On the 3rd of May 1977, a two-man Canberra was returning to its base at RAF Whiten, near the town of Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire, England. Around 12:15 p.m, just as the local school children at Sapley Park Primary School were preparing to walk home for lunch, the Canberra's engine stopped. It later transpired that the pilot was practicing what to do in the event of an engine failure, but something went wrong. The plane nosedived straight towards the school, but the pilot held fast, struggling to miss it and the surrounding houses. He was successful, but as the plane crashed to the ground, with its wing resting against houses in Norfolk Road on the Oxmoor estate, its fuel sprayed out and ignited. The resulting fireball engulfed a terrace of 7 homes. 5 people were killed, the pilot, his navigator, and 3 children. It soon became clear, however, that if the pilot had ejected to save himself, the outcome could have been much, much worse. One of the most well-known volcanoes in the world is located here, not far from the Bay of Naples on Italy's west coast. Mount Vesuvius has erupted numerous times over the centuries, most famously in AD 79, when it destroyed the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. It is the only volcano on the European mainland to have erupted during the last 100 years. The 2 other active Italian volcanoes, Etna and Stromboli, both in a state of almost continual eruption, are on islands. Vesuvius's last eruption began on the 13th of March 1944 and lasted on and off until the 29th of March. Italy was a divided country at the time. One of Nazi Germany's main allies in the Second World War, the country had finally surrendered to the Allied forces the previous September. Germany had immediately invaded, reinstating the fascist leader Benito Mussolini in the north of the country, while Italian partisans, aided by the Allies, waged a fierce civil war from the south. Allied troops were stationed near Vesuvius, with the volcano's observatory serving as their meteorological station. This meant that the observatory's director, Giuseppe Imbo, had only one room from which to observe the volcano's changing patterns. Accordingly, the eruption, when it came, took everyone by surprise, including the military. Thousands of people fled their homes, and 26 people were killed. A few of the casualties were caused by the explosion of a water tank hit by lava. The mountainside villages of San Sebastiano al Vesuvio, Ottaviano, and Massa di Somma were all but destroyed, as was part of San Giorgio a Cremano and all 88 planes in a US B-52 bomber group stationed at the airport of Tersigno to the east of the mountain. The sequence of the eruption was similar to earlier ones from 1631 onward. It began with an emission of lava flow, followed by powerful lava fountains, and it culminated in an explosive stage featuring a sustained eruption column. The comparatively low number of casualties, however, was because the destruction was caused more by the lava flows than the explosive activity. Because, as leading volcanologist Professor Bill Maguire of University College London once pointed out, you'd have to be nailed to the floor to be killed by lava. It moves so slowly. In fact, in San Sebastiano, village boys were recorded roasting chestnuts on the lava flows as they edged past. Since 1944, the destroyed villages have been rebuilt. The area is now densely populated, with locals drawn to the rich and fertile volcanic soil on the mountain. Considering prior to 1944, its cycle of quiet periods varied from 18 months to 7.5 years, meaning the stretch since 1944 is the longest in nearly 500 years, it does seem as if the volcano is long overdue for another eruption. It is not thought that Vesuvius is due to erupt in the near future, however, though its tendency towards sudden and extreme violent explosions and the dense population on and near the mountain is a continual challenge for authorities working on efficient evacuation plans. Currently, the plan relies on the authorities receiving between 2 weeks and 20 days' notice of an eruption before using trains, ferries, cars and buses to remove some 600,000 people living within the so-called Zona Rossa, or Red Zone. The old observatory used by Allied troops in 1944 is now a museum, and the volcano is closely monitored by a brand new facility in Naples. So far, there has been no magma discovered within 10 kilometers of the Earth's surface. So far. The U-2 crisis of 1960 began when a U-2 spy plane piloted by American Frank Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union on the 1st of May of that year. Having left the Air Force with the rank of captain in 1956, Powers had been recruited by the CIA's U-2 program, which conducted espionage missions. Stationed in Pakistan, Powers was shot down by a surface-to-air missile and convicted of espionage by the Soviets. Sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and 7 years hard labor, he was released in February 1962 in an exchange deal for a KGB colonel. In the US, he faced accusations of failing in his duty by not committing suicide or destroying the mission photographs, but he was cleared. Having died in a helicopter accident in 1977, he was finally awarded several posthumous medals in 2000 on the 40th anniversary of his fateful mission. For Generation Xers growing up in England in the 60s and 70s, there were no more notorious faces or names than those belonging to Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. Dubbed the Moors murderers, the pair were arrested in 1965 for the murders of 5 children and adolescents, burying 4 of them in the Saddleworth Moor area in Lancashire, northern England. The murders took place over 2 years, often with Hindley approaching the victims and asking for help before Brady would abduct, sexually assault and murder them. The final 2 victims, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey and 17-year-old Edward Evans, were killed in the house Hindley shared with her grandmother at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue in Hattersley. Brady murdered Evans in front of Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, who went to the police. Brady escaped the death penalty as it had been abolished a year earlier, but he and Hindley were described by the judge at their court case as 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. Judged criminally insane, Brady will never be released, while Hindley died behind bars of a heart attack in 2002. Changi Prison was first constructed by Singapore's British administration in 1936. It was a civilian prison, and after the fall of Singapore to the Japanese in World War II, in February 1942, the Japanese continued to use it, housing some 3,000 civilians in a facility built for 600. Despite its reputation, prisoners of war were rarely held there. Instead, the Japanese used the British Army's nearby Selarang barracks as a prisoner of war camp. Around 50,000 Allied soldiers, mostly British and Australians, were held captive in Selarang, but Changi is the name that came to be remembered. Over the 3.5-year period until the Japanese surrendered in September 1945, 850 prisoners of war died in the camp. Abuse, deprivation and suffering were rife in Selarang, but so were displays of remarkable resilience. One of the most notorious instances was the Barrack Square incident, which followed the recapture and execution of 4 Allied POWs. Furious at their actions, the Japanese commander tried to force the entire camp to sign a no-escape pledge, which outraged the British and Australians, who believed it was actually their duty to try and escape if they could. All but 3 of them refused to sign the pledge, so the Japanese forced the rest, around 17,000 men, into the open square without water or sanitation for 5 days. As dysentery spread like wildfire, the prisoners eventually agreed to sign, but only under duress, and many of them used false names. Ned Kelly was a particularly popular choice. Even in the dismal conditions, the prisoners found some hope. A group of mainly Australian prisoners managed to build a chapel there in 1944, using found materials, and a British serviceman fashioned a Christian cross out of a used artillery shell. Prominent prisoners included Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the mathematician Sir Alexander Oppenheim, author James Clavell, and the British cartoonist Ronald Searle. The renowned humanitarian Sir Ernest Weary Dunlop was also transferred to Changi briefly, before leading the first group of Australians to work on the Thai section of the Burma Railway. It was there and other Japanese forced labour camps like Sandakan that saw far greater numbers of casualties from the brutal conditions. The Burma Railway was also known as the Death Railway, and for good reason. The current Changi Museum was opened in 2001 on the 59th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. One of its main stated aims is to allow closure for the many emotional scars inflicted by the war years.